everybody, and welcome to the Art of Planet Zoo, where we'll be giving you a presentation about how we went about designing for a highly creative player base. So before we kick it off, let's just quickly introduce ourselves. My name is Liesa Bauwens, and I'm a senior artist. I was one of the lead environment artists on Planet Zoo.
And my name is Ijke Botman. I'm a producer on Planet Zoo. I produce the concept art and scenery art teams.
Today, for those of you who don't know what Planet Zoo is, so Planet Zoo is a management simulation game where you as a player get to build the zoo that you've always imagined and dreamed of. This means that we get a bit of a combination of highly creative and very management-focused players, and of course everything in between. And the main thing that I want to highlight before we get started is that we have a modular building system. So this means that our players can create pretty much piece by piece all of the scenery that you see here in this trailer. So for instance, all these large landscapes have been built with singular assets put together. So this means that we give our players a lot of creative freedom. And with that freedom does come the fact that we have to anticipate somewhat what they're going to do with it. Now, sometimes we are successful in that, sometimes we aren't, and this talk is kind of about when we are and when we aren't, and how we got better at concepting for that creative player base. So, without any further ado, let us pop into the first slide. Oh, that skips the video. There we go.
Yeah, so there's three things that we're going to talk about in this presentation. First of all, we're going to be talking about the player base and the fact that because they are so incredibly creative, it's sometimes very difficult to think about what they actually need and want. So how do we consider the assets that we make for these like extremely creative players? The other thing we want to talk about is our concepting workflow, and they all these topics kind of blend into each other in some ways. But I think that what's interesting for us is that we went through a little bit of a change in how we approached our concept work, and we started off one way, and we sort of ended up in a different, with a different workflow for concept, and that helped us a lot. So we're going to be talking about that, and then also we want to talk about the different player archetypes that our game has and how we support them. So we've got very creative players that build everything themselves, and then we've got management players that sort of want a functioning park, but not necessarily want to spend a lot of time, making it look good. They just want to build a functioning park. These creative players are really interesting because they basically need really interesting, aesthetically pleasing assets. They need assets that look really good, but they need them, they need components, they need smaller pieces because they want to do most of the building themselves. Whereas the management focused players are looking for assets that have a very specific purpose. Like for example, it could bring up their scenery score. That's how they use them. They put it in a habitat, and that sort of improves the welfare of the animal, for example, or brings up the scenery score for their park. They're also looking for more easy to build assets. They're looking for stuff they can just place down. Whereas, like I said, the creative player wants to build everything themselves. And then we've got FlexiColor. FlexiColor is a system in the game that allows the player to change the color of an asset. If we set it up that way, they can go in and they can change various elements of the asset. They can change the colors of various elements of the asset. This is interesting for both player bases. Like the creative player can sort of, it's like the finishing touch. It's them going in and really making everything their own. It's like super granular changes to whatever it is that they're making. Whereas the management focused player, they can use it too, but they use it in a different way because for them it's a really easy way to make an asset look a little bit more unique or a little bit more suitable for the environment that it's been placed in. So we started off with a workflow from concept to sort of, finishing up the model. And I'm going to describe that workflow. And then afterwards, Liesa is going to sort of describe what we ended up with, what we changed to, what we realized we could do better. So initially, we would define the theme and we would get inspiration, like a mood board. Like, for example, on the right here, you see our Africa theme that we shipped with base game. So we would go and look at reference for architecture or color or patterns or anything that's interesting that we could sort of figure out how to understand what this theme would look and feel like. But then very quickly we would make an asset list, and this asset list was almost in a way disconnected from the theme and inspirations to a certain degree, because the asset list is something that is really similar across themes. Like we would do an Africa theme, but we also did an India theme or an East Asia theme, where these themes will have the same types of assets. They will have bins, they will have benches, they will have lamps, windows, doors. So for us, it was just a matter of making a list, bin 1, door 2, door 3. Make a list, give this list to the concept artist. They pick, one of them to work on. They talk to the art director, figure out what it is that it should look like, communicate a little bit back and forth, some feedback, and then they finish the asset and we give it to the scenery team. Then the scenery team takes it, creates a block out, and the scenery team starts, playing around with it and using it in the game. And, that's when we start, seeing some things that maybe aren't that good about this workflow. So that's the workflow. So what that meant was, for example, the initial asset list became quite inorganic. It became something that was the same for every theme, and didn't necessarily come from like a cohesive place where we're creating an asset list based on, a type of a scene that we want to build, or a building that we want to be able to build, or something that the players should be able to build. It was more of a, these are all the items that we need. We're going to do them for every theme. And that's sort of, it's a less organic way to create an asset list. We needed it at that point. I think at that point we were in full production, and we just needed to, we had 4 or 5 themes, hundreds of assets. We needed to make quick decisions about these assets and get them out and work on them. But as we got into sort of the later themes and we started getting into DLC, we were able to look at our process and start to realize some of the things that we could improve on. For example, 3D blockouts became, the blockouts became interesting because they needed a lot of revising. Because when you translate 2D to 3D, that's a different medium in a way. So when the scenery artists start playing around with it, they start to realize that, maybe something doesn't work, scale doesn't work, or whatever, there's something about it that doesn't work. We need to revisit the blockout. And that was pretty apparent that we were, iterating a lot on the blockouts. I think that stemmed from the idea that our artists were just kind of unfamiliar with how players use assets, and they were sort of unaware of how the game limitations or like game mechanics in terms of these assets. So our concept artists are concepting assets for a game that they are not really familiar with in terms of, how do players actually play with this game? What do they use these assets for? How do they create the things that they create? How does the game actually function? What are the limitations of the game? How do you place it? How do you snap it? How do you rotate? Like all of this stuff, the concept artists weren't necessarily familiar with, which meant that the stuff that they were concepting, once it got to the scenery people started like poking it and sort of pointing out that maybe we need something different, which was pretty late in the process. Like that's preferably you would want that a little bit earlier, because at that point you've already made a concept, you've done blockouts, and then you start realizing that you need to go back to blockout, maybe you need to go back to concept even, and that can be, costly and, and not that efficient. So we found we were able to move towards a different workflow that Liesa is going to talk about now.
Yeah, so there's a couple of changes that we made, but I think the biggest one was to get our concept artists actually playing the game. And when we asked our concept artists about this, they also said that that contributed massively to their understanding of how players would make it. Because once they're playing the game, they too are players and they will think of things that they're missing currently in the item inventory and things that they wish they could build with. So we still started by defining our themes and inspirations, but then we would ask our concept artists to spend some more time in game, look at player creations. So our previous game, Planet Coaster, had the same modular building structure. That meant that we were able to show our concept artists like, hey, this is things that people were building in the previous game. Maybe you can kind of let that inform how you think of your concepts as well. And they found this really beneficial. So when they started to play the game and actually build things, they had a way better understanding of what makes the game tick and what will actually work as an interesting asset for them to design. So what we started doing was creating overview panes. Usually these would be started off a screenshot from in-game, like this one is, that you can see here on the right. And then a concept artist would go over and do essentially a big overview painting where they really try and nail down the unique feeling and kind of distinctive nature of a theme as cohesively as possible. Because you have this really big screenshot, that you're painting over rather than just doing asset by asset, because that's how the asset list is in your to-do list. We were able to get what I like to call these happy accident assets, where they probably would never have made it on the asset list, but you're just painting and you think, oh, it would be nice if we had some posters here, or maybe if I put a butterfly on this roof, we could turn that into some kind of light or something. So you get this rather more organically created asset list rather than one that we just hash out from the beginning and then try and stick to as much as possible. So once we had the overview paint, we derived the asset list, and then like before, we put all the assets in our tracking software. And we started distributing them out. But because we had this one big paint, we were able to show to all of our different concept artists, like, hey, this is what we want you to try and aim for. This is the vibe that we want to instill into this theme. And we found that everything was a lot more cohesive when we followed this kind of structure. And because our concept artists were now used to the game, they were playing the game, we had a better understanding of what they can do in the game and what they can't, and how they can cheat, some of the limitations that we've got in place with our modular building system. This also meant that how usable an asset was and how flexible one was kept into mind a lot more before it even hit us at the 3D stage. So any blockouts that we did were a lot better, did not need the same kind of back and forth between us and concept. And the assets just felt a lot nicer to play with because the people who designed them had actual experience with the game. And, Andre apparently had 152 hours. He's one of our senior concept artists that he played on Planet Zoo. And he said that that was probably one of the numbers on the Steam library that he was most proud of. So it was also really fun for us as 3D artists to see the concept artists, play with the assets that we've made from their concepts. It was kind of a nice full circle to get back to that. So when we look at these overview paints, they were also really handy in kind of establishing a sense of scale and style and a general overview of architecture. In this particular case, we're looking at an Indian temple set. So because they've had more experience playing the game, they know how they would build this if they were building it in-game. When they were doing blockouts, rather than getting solid shapes that we would have gotten before, like one big building, they started to be able to pull out components, which is really important for our more creative players because they want to have that flexibility of building either this building or a completely different one with the same building blocks. And this time, concept artists were able to come to us and say, these are all the different pieces that I made this with. And at that point, instead of us having to do the parsing, we could just kind of sit down with production and say, okay, we're going to do these, and these. And there was a lot less second guessing, a lot less adjusting measurements and proportions because they'd already thought about it. they were just doing our job ahead of ourselves. So that was really, really, you know, nice. It kind of made the ride a lot smoother as well. And this is one of my favorite overview paints from the game. So this was for the Indian street kind of architecture. And this was also taken from a screenshot. You can still see the horizon line in the back from the game, and then painted over. And what I love about this is that almost every single little detail in this scene made it into a single unique concept. We started from this very big scene where, you know, you've got like, oh, there's some pots here that I really enjoy, or here's a little metal one, and I'm gonna make this little rickshaw bench. And because you can have this more fluid approach to this concept, all of the little touches that you just kind of put in can become reality, you know, easier than you would if you had it just on a cut and dry asset list. So this is the kind of fully fledged theme that we end up with. And you can see everything has been worked up, has been made, you know, to production standards, so we can actually start doing some 3D work off of it. And while everything is unique, it's also very cohesive. So that cohesiveness was a definite plus that we got from the overview paints, because they'd been concepted together. You know, something pretty minor like the archways, we were able to kind of really pull that out and say, oh, what if we want to do the pillars separately, and then you could put the arch on top. It's going to look really good. You know, that kind of stuff came a lot more organically because they were also thinking about it.
Yeah, and it's interesting in a way how when we've got concept artists working in the game, building stuff, how the stuff that we're actually creating also is getting influenced by them, by their experience. Because before you would have, you know, the scenery artists in the game, you'd have designers building levels, they're, you know, suggesting assets. But now we've also we would start getting concept artists, you know, suggesting assets. Can I have this, you know, roof shape? It would be nice if I could have this sort of primitive, you know, pyramid shape. It's really useful. Yeah, so one of the things we also wanted to talk about is blueprints, because blueprints is kind of the happy medium between building everything yourself and you know, having a functional park. There's like this in-between stage where if you're looking for something really nice to make your park look good, or if you want to learn how to build these really complicated things that the players are building but you don't know where to start, then blueprints is kind of the best place to be, because blueprints is our in-game system where all these assets that we make are put together and are essentially, you know, a single piece object that players can place. Like it could be a shop or a toilet or like a sculpture collection or whatever, but it's something that has been made to look pretty or interesting, or it's a, you know, it's a single placed object. They were pretty important on Planet Coaster, but they were hugely more important on Planet Zoo. We shipped them for every theme we did. I don't know, between 10 and 30 blueprints for each theme.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're very important to us because they allow the players that don't necessarily want to make their, you know, spend a lot of time making their park look good. It allows them to make their park look good. But also it's a really interesting type of asset because we allow players to upload it to the Steam Workshop. So the images that you see here, they are Steam Workshop images. Players have created this stuff. If you're interested, go and have a dig in what players have created, because it's absolutely insane. The things that they make is so impressive, and you just don't understand how they do it sometimes. But we knew that like the ability for someone to come in and, you know, learn from blueprints was very important. So, you know, it's a learning opportunity for new players. How do you build that little pumpkin house? You know, you've got no idea, but if you can take it from the Steam Workshop, tear it apart, because those are all individual assets. So you tear it apart, you can see what it's made of. Oh, they used this asset in some way to make it a little, you know, a little lamp thing on top of a log, and now it looks like a lamp on like a post or whatever. Like it's really clever ways to use assets, and that's, I think, what our game is about, is is about getting sort of inspired by other players and, you know, building something that, you know, surprises people. It also allows for a lot of personal, you know, expression. When you take a blueprint from someone else or from our game, you can sort of go in and, you know, you can make changes to it. You can pull out some pieces that you don't like, or maybe that you want to drop for some other reason. You can put in some stuff, make it a little bit your own, and that still gives you the feeling that you're building, that you are creative. You still get that sort of creative expression, you know, boost, but you're also working with an asset that is already there. It isn't, you know, you're not spending a ton of time. You're not spending days and days creating hugely complex buildings, but you are making your park look nice. And it's a starting point for the player. It's something where they can go in and they can just sort of get their park all looking nice, put in the essential stuff, work on the management side of things, and then start picking it apart and maybe, you know, making some stuff and spending time where they want to spend time. So yeah, so blueprints were really important for our players.
Yeah, definitely. And now we'd like to kind of slowly start rounding this presentation off with some examples of times where we had it wrong or where we had it right, you know, kind of taking checks and balances of decisions that we've made. And I like a lot of these. I think they're really interesting to me. I hope they're interesting to you as well. So we're going to look at a couple of case studies. So this is one of my favorite assets in the game. Not necessarily because of the way it looks, but because it's really intriguing. So this is the Tiger Arch. This is a hero asset. So we usually, to us, hero assets are those, you know, one big asset that you put in the center of your park as kind of like, wow, it's here kind of thing. So it's meant to be impressive. It's meant to look aesthetically really interesting. And, you know, it's nice for marketing purposes. It can really be a centerpiece to a very nice screenshot. And from a more selfish artist perspective, it's great fun to work on because, you know, tell a concept artist or a 3D artist that you get to make a giant tiger head, they're going to be pretty happy about it. But their reusability is quite low. We talk a lot about modular components and being able to reuse assets in different ways. These, because of their size and complexity, usually do not get that usability that much. And that's a shame because they're usually quite expensive to implement. So a lot of our hero assets cost easily double the amount of time spent. They'll take double the amount of maps compared to a regular asset, even a slightly more expensive regular asset. And they use different shaders sometimes for these ones, for the amount of detail that we want to get in. So they get really pricey. And the problem is we never quite know how much payback we're going to have for it. So for instance, this Tiger Arch, while it looks really nice and stuff, has actually only been placed just under 5,000 times in the game. The median of amounts of times placed is 8,754. So it's definitely not there. And I think the actual average, which is a bit skewed because we do have a lot of assets that get placed repetitively, like water bowls, food bowls, is around 30,000, I believe. So it is quite a ways off from being the average amount that it gets placed, but it has been very expensive. And this is something that we had to keep in mind a lot when we were deciding on what to add to an asset list. Because yes, we could spend 10 days on a huge asset like this, or we could spend 10 days and make 2 or maybe 3 assets that are a lot more versatile and can add a lot to a player's save file and give us more bang for our buck when it comes to time. And as an interesting side fact, this one actually ended up being so pricey for so little gain that by now this is half the size of what it is in the screenshot actually in game. We had to downgrade it because we just couldn't justify it. So that's an interesting one. Next one I found really intriguing is about our FlexiColor. So we mentioned earlier, FlexiColor is a system in which a player is able to recolor parts of a mesh. This comes with an authoring cost for us, but it's really nice for the player to be able to, you know, make a particular asset exactly the color they want it to be. So it's definitely a high payoff for them. Now, when we did our first DLC pack, that was our Arctic pack. And because of the architecture that we were referencing, we had loads of natural woods, really nice, bare wood, organic kind of sculpting style. For artists, it was really fun to work on. So we made the decision to not have a lot of flexicolor because we did not feel that it was thematically appropriate. Now, while the assets were popular, one of the first things that we noticed on our social media feeds was that players were asking, why is there not enough flexicolor? Why can't I recolor all of these things? I would have loved to have this in a different color. So we'd kind of taken that away from them, where we'd previously been very mindful about whether or not we add extra color in. So it was really interesting to see how much more important it was than we even anticipated, even if we thought about it ahead of time. And then the next DLC pack, we did South America. This naturally lent itself a lot more to flexicolor, but we this time made more of a conscious effort to say, okay, we have the bamboo wall, but we're going to make an extra version of it, and that one's going to be paintable, so people have the flexibility to repaint if they want to. And this was a lot more well received. It was a bit more work for us, but the players loved having a lot more color to play with. And it was definitely an interesting check again for us, because we thought we knew how important flexicolor was and that we could get away with not doing that much for it in the pack, to kind of get that reality check of, no, actually, players really miss that we took that kind of creative outlet away from them. So now it's definitely something that we keep in mind even more than we did before. And then just lastly, because I talked a bit about how much things get placed, I just think it's interesting. One of the most popular assets in our game is still Temperate Rocks. Well, Temperate Rock 01 and Planet Coaster, that was Tropical Rock 07. And rocks, plants, and trees are still going very strong in Planet Zoo as some of the most popular assets to place down. One of the things that I found quite interesting was the Arctic sculpture, the reindeer. So we talk a lot about the component stuff, and for the reindeer, we thought, wouldn't it be nice if people could, take the head off and the legs, because then you could you could rebuild your own reindeer and move it whichever way you want to. So, giving the player more of that flexibility. Except it turned out that the separate reindeer parts probably got placed only around 300 times each, which is very little. That's bottom of the pile little. And the reindeer sculpture fully assembled was a lot more popular. So that was a case of where we thought, yeah, they're going to love having this separately, where actually we probably didn't make that much of a difference, but we tried. Another one that I wanted to look at was the fallen mossy tree, because that actually took us a lot of time to make because it was so big. This could be considered a hero asset. But this one was placed 150,760 times, which makes that extra time and effort a lot more worth it. So it's always interesting to kind of go back and see, what did we spend a lot of time on and actually performed well, and what did we not spend a lot of time on, but actually was, placed loads. It's really interesting for us, and it helps us kind of inform decisions going forward of what we want to spend more or less time on.
Cool. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of stuff in this presentation that's pretty specific to the type of games that we make. But I think there's some key takeaways that are useful for everyone. First of all, I think if you understand what your player archetypes need, I think it'll help you make decisions. I think once you come to the point where you have to make decisions and you're looking at through various different lenses, you can look at it from the from the player need lens or from the budget lens or whatever. You're looking at it from some perspective. Obviously the player type is a hugely important perspective, and for us to be able to identify so clearly between these two player types helps us a lot. And it's something that we think about a lot, because they both are really valid players and they both need different things. So definitely, keep an eye on your player types and understand what drives them and what they need, and use that to make, decisions. And then obviously everyone should play the game. But when you start having people that don't necessarily always play the game, have them play the game, just look at what happens, because it's really interesting. It becomes this sort of a new experience. It's a different experience for them, but also just watching them is really interesting, because everyone brings something unique to when they play a game. So when a concept artist plays a game, or this game, that's a different experience than from a designer or gameplay coder or a producer to play the game. And for us, it was hugely beneficial. I think having our concept artist play the game really made a difference, especially in the later themes that we produced. So the India theme we did it for, and the Asia theme we did it for, and then also our DLCs were benefited from it a lot. And yeah, I think if you're looking at your assets and you're trying to anticipate player needs, if you have the ability to allow for creative expression within those assets, the more modular probably the better, or at least sometimes, maybe not if it's a reindeer sculpture, but it's very useful for players. It's very interesting for players to be able to take a piece and imagine it in a different way. So I would also, I would say to the creative players, like, look at those reindeer legs and try to figure out, something fun to do with it, because I'm pretty sure.
Please place it more than 300 times, please.
Yeah. Yeah. But that's if you allow the player to really come up with their own strategy, their own way of playing the game, and if your game allows for it, that really becomes a really interesting and fun experience for them. So make your assets modular, I think, is a big component of a game, this type of game, to make that an interesting experience.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And while I think this was probably a little bit of a niche talk, I hope that you found something interesting in it, maybe found our look back at what we've done interesting. I hope you've picked something up if you also are working on a game like this or want to make a game like this. I hope that this has given you some insights. Thank you so much for tuning in to our presentation, and enjoy the rest of your day.
All right, thank you.
Bye-bye.